my name is Charlotte and welcome to or back to my channel. So we've spoken all about yarn. I've told you everything you need to know about needles. I've taught you how to cast on, and this week we're going to be actually knitting. This week I'll be teaching you how to do the knit stitch and the purl stitch. These are the main two stitches in knitting and they allow you to do loads of different stitches such as the stockinette stitch, garter stitch and ribbing. I'll tell you more about those a little bit later. I'll teach you everything from holding the needles and yarn to actually knitting the stitches. And stay tuned for the end of the video where I give you my top tips on how to avoid making common mistakes with your knitting. I upload to my YouTube on Wednesdays, but if you do want to hang out with me at any other time, I am on Twitch streaming every Monday, Tuesday and Thursday, so go check that out. I post all my finished knitting objects on my Instagram and also my work in progresses, so do go check that out if you're interested at @SmichaelGoesKnitting. I also have a Patreon where you can go support me if you want to, and you can receive some really cool benefits, so please do go check that out if you're interested. All of these links are in the description. If you like this video, please do give me a like, it really helps me out. Next week we're going to be finishing our knitted objects. I'm going to be teaching you how to cast off. I'm going to teach you a few different ways that I like to cast off personally and give you some recommendations on what I think you should start off using. So if you're excited for that video or you want to learn more, please do subscribe down below and click that notification bell so you don't miss any of my uploads. And without further ado, let's get into the video. Before I get into teaching you the knit stitch, I do want to let you know that you will need to hold your working yarn, which is the yarn connected to the ball of yarn, throughout the entire time you're knitting. There are two different ways you can hold it. You can either hold it in your left hand, which is called knitting continental or picking, or in your right hand, which is called knitting English style or throwing. I'll show you both, however I personally knit continental with the yarn in my left hand. Before I do show you how to hold the yarn, I do want to let you know that there's no one correct way to hold the yarn whilst knitting. It's what works for you. So you need to make sure you find something that you're comfortable with, but that also gives you good tension in knitting. So if you find that holding it in your left hand the way I show you isn't comfortable for you, that's perfectly fine. Try and explore different ways of holding it so that you keep a kind of solid but not too tight tension on the working yarn, so that when you knit, you keep a good tension. To knit English style, you have to hold the working yarn in your right hand, which is the yarn connected to the ball. What most people do is wrap the working yarn around their pinky finger, lay it across their ring and middle fingers and grip that not too tight so that it can still move, and then over their index finger. When knitting English style, you want to wrap the yarn clockwise around the needle, and when wrapping, I hold the two needles in my left hand like so. As you can see, I struggle quite a bit with this method. It doesn't come naturally to me, so I much prefer knitting continental. To knit continental, you want to hold the working yarn in your left hand. A lot of people do hold the yarn the same way as in English style, around the pinky, over the fingers and then over the index finger. I personally don't wrap it around my pinky, I don't find it comfortable, but it's all about what works for you. What you do need to make sure is that you're careful to not mix up the working yarn and the tail yarn, which I have done in the past. Now you've cast on all the stitches you need. As you can see, I've used the long tail cast on here. If you missed last week's video where I taught you the 3 cast on methods, do go check that out, and then we can get on to knitting. So the needle with the stitches on needs to be on your left hand, and the needle with nothing on it needs to be in your right. Holding your working yarn to the back of your work, which is away from you, you want to knit into the middle of the first stitch by sliding the needle in your right hand from the left to the right of each stitch, like so. Now you have this cross. The right hand needle should be at the bottom of the left hand needle. You want to be wrapping the working yarn, either clockwise or anti-clockwise, around the bottom needle. So if you see there, you've got one wrap around the needle. Then you want to pull this through to the front, like so. So you still have a cross, but the right hand needle is on top of the left hand needle this time. And then you want to slide the stitch off the left hand needle. Then you want to continue to repeat this until you've done this to every single one of the stitches on your left hand needle. I'll show you slowly how it will look. Between stitches, make sure you keep a good tension on your working yarn and don't be afraid to hold the needles and re-wrap the working yarn around your hand so that it keeps a good tension. So you go into the stitch, wrap the working yarn around, pull that to the front and slip off the needle. Into the stitch, working yarn wrap around, bring to the front, and then slip off the needle. And you just continue to do this until the end of the row. Here I'm showing you what it looks like to knit English style. As you can see, I'm not very good at it at all. I don't think I've knit English style for the last 6 years, so I'm a bit rusty at it. This may be how you enjoy knitting, but it's not for me. But I thought it was important to show you what it looks like. So you're holding the needles and you're taking your right hand off the needle to then wrap around the bottom needle. Once you've finished knitting all the stitches, you want to move the needle with all the stitches back into your left hand, so you're always knitting from left to right. So if you continue like this, then you will get the garter stitch, which is what is on screen right now, and this is created by knitting every single row. Before I get into the purl stitch, I do just want to say if you are a complete beginner, maybe it's a better idea for you to just try and practice the knit stitch first until you're comfortable with it and then move on to the purl stitch. But do stick around till the end of the video because I'll give you my top tips on how to avoid common mistakes. Before I teach you how to do the purl stitch, there's one important thing to remember, and that's purling is basically the same as knitting, but it's done a bit back to front. It's difficult to visualise, but I'll show you what I mean. So with the purl stitch, you want to hold your working yarn to the front of your work towards you, either in your left or right hand. For the purl stitch, you want to knit into the middle of the stitch from right to left, from the back to the front. I'll show you what I mean. So you want to go in through the back, from the right to the left of the first stitch on your needle, as you can see here. Then you want to wrap your working yarn around the bottom needle, same way as you did to knit, but this time you want to pull it back over to the back of the work. So again you have this cross, but it's just pointed at you. Again you want to slip the stitch off the left hand needle like so. This is pretty confusing for a beginner who hasn't grasped the knit stitch, so again I would recommend that you focus on the knit stitch first, but I will be doing this slowly so you can see more what I mean.
Something I like to do to make sure I have a good grip of the needles is if it feels unstable during the knitting process, I use my thumb and index finger to hold the two needles together, like you can see me doing here. I haven't included any footage of me purling with the yarn in my right hand English style because I simply cannot do it, and as bad as my knitting was English style, the purling is so much worse, so I didn't want to show you guys anything that would be completely useless to you. So again, if you do purl every row you end up with garter stitch, but as I'll show you in the next clip, there are some different patterns that you can achieve from alternating knitting and purling. So here we have garter stitch, which is made by knitting every single row. Above that we have the stockinette stitch, which is made by knitting one row, then purling the next and repeating. This is garter stitch but purling every row. And then this stitch pattern is ribbing, which is where you knit one stitch, purl the next and repeat that till the end of the piece. Here they are all together. They all create different textures and used for different purposes, but they're all very fun to do once you get the hang of it.
So now's the time that you've all been waiting for. My top tips on how to avoid mistakes in your knitting and make it look as nice as possible. Top tip number 1 is don't pull your working yarn too tight when knitting, because then otherwise you won't be able to knit in it on the next row that you go into. You obviously don't want to let it hang loose because that'll leave big holes in your project. However, don't pull it so tight that you're not able to knit into it, because then that also doesn't look as great either. On that note, do make sure you are holding the yarn at all times while you're knitting. It's fine to let go after the row and kind of recoup once you've finished the row before you start the next row. However, you do want to be holding it all the time, otherwise it will go too loose and you won't be able to keep a consistent tension when knitting. So it'll just look a bit weird.
I do want to quickly clarify that you can release the working yarn to readjust it, but just don't let it hang loose whilst you're dealing with the rest of the knitting.
Tip 3 is to make sure you only wrap the working yarn around the right hand needle once. And that's because if you wrap it around it twice or 3 times, it'll look like there are more stitches on your needle, it'll leave a hole in your work, and you'll start to increase the number of stitches that you're knitting, so your work will start to flare out. If when I was learning to knit I got a pound every single time I accidentally increased the stitch where I didn't mean to, I wouldn't have the student debt I'm in right now. Tip number 4 is to make sure that the stitches that you're going to knit on your left hand needle are close to the needle tip, and while you're working you're continually pushing it towards the needle tip. Not so close that they fall off, but close enough that you don't have to overstretch the yarn while you're knitting it, because that makes it very uncomfortable, slightly painful, and it makes the work look a bit weird. Tip number 5 is something that I personally do. I don't know if everyone else does it, but when I am bringing the right hand needle out from under the left hand needle and on top to bring the stitch forward, I curl my index finger, which has the working yarn in it, to secure the yarn to that needle so it doesn't slip off at all. Tip number 6 is something I also do, and it is when you are knitting, using your index finger on the right hand needle to secure the stitches as you're knitting them. Obviously you can't hold it there all the time, but just using it to make sure stitches just don't slip off. Tip number 7 is probably the most important rule, and that is that it's all a process. Learning is a process. Please do not get upset if what you're doing doesn't look as pretty as you want it to. I've been knitting for 10 years and it's only the past few years where I've felt that I'm really happy with the quality of knitting that I've been pushing out there. Doesn't mean that you won't produce anything that's pretty, but just have fun with it. It's knitting, you can make it whatever you want, and it's probably my most favourite thing to do, so just enjoy. So I hope you liked this video and you found it useful. If you did find it useful and you learnt something, please do give me a like, that really helps me out. If you have watched all the way through the video, thank you so much. If you already know how to knit and you're watching this video, thank you from the bottom of my heart, you're far too kind. I'd love to see all your first knitted pieces, so please do tag me on Instagram at @SmichaelGoesKnitting with the hashtag #SmichaelKnit, so I can see everything that you guys are doing, and hopefully we can see a progress over time and see how much better you're getting at it. Like I mentioned earlier, I upload every Wednesday evening around 6 PM, but if you do want to hang out with me, I live stream on Twitch every Monday, Tuesday and Thursday, so please do go check me out there at @SmichaelGoesKnitting. And I also have a Patreon, so if you want to support me, you can go over there, pledge some money, and you will get stuff in return, which is exciting. So please do go check that out if you're interested. Next week, we will be casting off. We'll be finishing your projects, hopefully the first of many to come. So if you are interested in that video, please do click that subscribe button and the notification bell so you don't miss any of my uploads. I look forward to hanging out with you guys again. Stay wholesome.
A pair of jeans, a shirt or two.